an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Wall of Storms, chapters 16 and 17. In these chapters, we find out exactly what caused this forest fire. Guys, these chapters are called Fighting Fire and Through the Veil. And I'm not sure if I am reading too much into it, but it definitely has a feel to me of growing up and seeing the world for what it is in a way that you never wanted to. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. I don't think Kyle is in the chat right now. I'm hoping that he can make it, though. Yeah, guys, this is finally really starting to take shape. These episodes have been spaced pretty far apart. And sometimes that can be a problem, especially reading, because books tend to be a lot more jammed with details and small plot developments or information that you need to retain, and it can be hard when there's a long gap between. But I feel like this story actually, it works okay with them being this spread out because it's a really, really slow-moving narrative so far. And when I say slow-moving narrative, that makes it sound like I'm saying something bad, but that's not what I mean at all. I don't feel about this story like it's paced wrong. I don't feel like there is something that we need to fix here. I think that this setup is at the pace it needs to be for us to get a really good grip of who Zomi is. And this is the kind of thing that could easily be rushed in the short term to appease impatient readers and give them more action. And I think that would be a mistake. I think it would ultimately be a disservice to the character and not set things up as well for the plot either. So I appreciate that it feels like Ken Liu is trusting his readers a little bit here and allowing them to experience it all exactly how they need to, because he knows that they will understand that this is worthwhile in the end. And that is it's a nice thing to have. Listen, okay, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I just went to see the new Star Wars yesterday, and it wasn't good. I was going to say it wasn't great. It wasn't even good. And there is a huge issue, in my opinion, with the writers of that script not trusting their viewers. That, to me, is something that you can see a mile away. And I find it deeply, deeply insulting when it feels like they just don't think I'm going to get it and they beat me over the head, or they rush things because they think I'm going to get bored. And I can't handle that kind of condescension. And I just really appreciate that that's not what's happening here. So let's back it up. Chapter 16, Fighting Fire. Crescent Island, the first year in the reign of 4 placid seas, 5 years before the first grand examination. I'm going to summarize a little bit before we get started with the beat-by-beat stuff, and I am just going to say, this chapter, if I were reading this as a teenager, maybe even a little older, early 20s, if I were reading this any more than a decade ago, perhaps less, I would have thought this was too much. Because we have a villain who turns up. He is, I believe, an earl. And we wind up finding out that he was the one who set this forest fire because he was trying to frighten out of the underbrush a particularly rare species of boar so that he could kill it to get its very unusual tusks. This man starts this forest fire, And then when the villagers are gathered around him, he attempts to send them off to fight the fire that he started, even though it is more than evident that that there is no point to this. There is no way that they are actually going to be able to prevent anything from being engulfed here. And then is willing to sacrifice literally every person he comes across to save himself. And it would be really, really understandable if people felt like this was pretty heavy-handed. But I have to admit that as I see the world a little bit more clearly, I realize that this is precisely correct. Precisely correct. Guys, a person comes into a piece of property, a land, a country that isn't theirs, razes it to the ground to exploit it for a resource that is not even necessary for survival a lot of the time. Is something that is simply like a petty sort of fetishistic artifact, and then leaves that mess they have created behind for the local people, the natives, to clean up, implying in doing so that they are not even responsible for it, that these native people are the ones that are responsible for their own land despite taking control of it away from them. And then even going so far as to say it's what they would have wanted to do anyway. I mean, this is so on point that might be what is sort of heavy-handed about it, is the fact that it is exactly 100% correct. I can't emphasize enough how shook I was by this chapter and the series of events that begin to unfold here. Ken Liu is so anti-capitalist and so billionaire class, and just I fucking love this author so much. There are plenty of authors out there who are anti-exploitation and, really have storylines about the lower classes being victimized and whatnot. But I feel like Ken Liu is much more big picture and really willing to go places with it that are more complicated. I am just so impressed, y'all. I can't even tell you. I really, really love the turn of events here. So, all right. We have the nobleman. He turns up. Don't just stand there. Why don't you organize the peasants to go fight the fire? Zomi is watching them and is just like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? And he says, get shovels and buckets and whatever else you can find. If you concentrate your efforts, you may be able to delay the fire long enough for the balloon to take off. Guys, again, he isn't even like, oh, maybe you'll be able to save your village. He's like, you might be able to delay the fire long enough for me and my people to get away, and really thinks that this is something that should be a priority for them. Are you afraid to die? It's an honor to die for the life of a great lord. Guys, look, any veterans listening to this, I want you to hear what I'm saying, not as an indictment of what you have done and the risks you have taken. I want you to hear this as an indictment of the people in power above you. I despise the weaponization of troops, and I don't mean that in the usual way of weaponization of troops. We have created a culture in which, quote, respecting the troops or honoring them is treated as some sort of it is treated as a almost religious, sacred, like ritual, except without any of the genuine belief behind it, so as to fool people into sacrificing themselves for a machine that does not care about them. And those of you, again, who are veterans, I'm not trying to say that you have been fooled, because plenty of people go into military service because they need to have school paid for, or because sometimes they just don't know what to do. And they're like, you know what, I'm going to explore this thing and try out something that will like allow me time to travel, that will pay for expenses for a while and figure things out while I'm there. And then there are times where it's like, I'm trying to fight for a cause. I think that the fact that we have created a system in which the poor can only have school paid for if they risk their lives for a war that they may not be informed about is really disgusting and a symptom of a horrific capitalist hellscape. And I do not for one moment believe that the most pro-troops politicians out there actually give any kind of shit about the lives of troops. And I think that we have created a strange culture of it's an honor to die for your country as a means of making ourselves feel better sometimes for the fact that we have been blatantly exploited for being poor and not being able to get out of going into service. Because while the draft might not have been something enacted anytime recently, when it was, if you were in college, you got exempt. If you, like, there were just so many loopholes for those who have money. And there is no way to see that other than if you're poor, you don't matter as much. So you're going to go. Now, I want to be as honest as I can here. And there is a point at which he says something about how you can't possibly think that any of these native people's lives is worth the life of my servant, to Zomi. This sounds incredibly disgusting coming from this guy, and it is disgusting. But I want everybody listening to really take a second and like reflect on the difference that in what you feel about the death of a stranger, depending on who they are and their standing in society, and really consider where that comes from. That is not to say that you don't immediately follow up that gut reaction with a, wow, that's fucked up. I can't believe I feel that way. Because we do. Oftentimes we have grown to sort of see the way that we think about things, and we are trying to do better. The first thing that we think is how our brain is programmed. And the thing that we think of immediately after is who we actually are as a person and the fact of who we are when we engage our brain. Two different things. When we hear that a homeless person died versus, say, let's say a homeless person dies because they were left out in the cold, and a senior citizen dies in their home because they could not afford to turn the heat on. Which of those things means more to you in that instant? Because I think for most of us, we have a much more gut reaction to the senior citizen dying because they can't afford to turn the heat on. This is somebody that we can relate to more. They have a home. They have made it as far into their lives as we hope to make it. They are simply going through a temporary struggle with finances, and they tried to cut corners by turning off the heat, and they didn't make it. This is something that we understand and feel. A person who is homeless, we can tell ourselves made mistakes we would never make, that they wound up in a situation that probably was partially their fault. And when we hear homeless person, we immediately sort of think of them as somebody who is abandoned by society, and oftentimes assume that person had no family. Because if they did, why wouldn't they be staying with them? Whereas a senior who is left alone, we feel probably has grandkids because they had a home, and their family will be horribly upset by this loss. And so we are also assigning this like whole other part of grief, which is a grieving family hearing about their family member who died of exposure, which we don't assign to a homeless person necessarily. And I bring this up simply to say, we make a lot of assumptions in a fucking instant about people that we don't know in order to distance ourselves from a tragedy. And by distance ourselves, I mean, we want to believe that this couldn't happen to us. So we find ways to put spaces between ourselves and the person. And we also, I think, want there to be a hierarchy of things to care about, because caring about every single life equally is too much for us to handle. And I fully believe that this is like a coping mechanism that we have in some ways, where you get to a point that if you continue to feel the pure sadness and horror of every unjust death the same way as every other, you will become overwhelmed and exhausted, and it will just drain you. So we have found a way to sort of make certain deaths less important so that we don't get as upset by them. So all of this to get at, when this man says certain lives are worth more than others, it's really easy to just be like, you piece of shit. But we need to recognize the fact that we also do this. All of us as people do this. And when Zomi says, I don't care about them, I care about the people close to me, it sounds awfully harsh, but it is understandable, and it is what most of us do. And she is simply being very honest about that in a way that a lot of us aren't courageous enough to be. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, because I am going to be talking shit about this Earl, and he deserves every bit of it. But I want everyone to recognize the fact that he is simply an exaggerated example of something that is in all of us. And he is the type of person that he is out there in the world right the fuck now. This man isn't a cartoon, as much as it would be nice to say that. There are people who talk and behave precisely this way. But in saying that, it makes it sound very, very far away from the experience that we have, because he has so much money and power. And I just want to underline that you don't have to have money and power to still do things this way mentally. So anyway, I just needed to really outline this all so that you guys get where I'm coming from here. So we have this moment that I really like of Zomi watching the elder Kuni sit down, and he begins to speak to his people. And Zomi, who has watched a lot of folk operas with this language, is able to piece together what he is saying. Children, the village is doomed. Houses may be rebuilt and gardens replanted, but people cannot be replaced. Go and escape by the cliff route. But grandfather, you won't be able to make it with your legs. Do not trouble yourselves about me. Go on. Go. And then it says, Zomi felt her eyes grow warm and her throat constrict. She was thinking of her mother and how she would behave if a fire approached and Zomi couldn't get away because of her leg. And I just didn't even think of that. I know that Zomi, can't walk easily. She has this brace, which helps now. But nevertheless, I should have realized that she would relate deeply to this instance with this guy. And I didn't even think of it. And then we have Luan, who is talking to the soldiers about them trying to disconnect this balloon because they're really just about to flee on his property and not even ask about it. And also, Luan is a really high-ranking noble, and he could pull that card out, and he never does, which I just deeply admire and respect, and don't know if I could have had that kind of strength. So this is when this guy is talking about the fires to drive out the boar. And Luan is didn't you know how dangerous that was? And the guy doesn't even respond. He just says it worked. I got 6 trophies. It's not my fault the winds shift so quickly around here. We had to leave behind everything at our camp and barely managed to escape with our lives. So at this point, Luan realizes that it is going to be necessary to empty out the gondola of practically all his possessions, because this fucking Earl is insisting on escaping with the gondola, and he isn't willing to give up any of his own people. And at this point, Luan comes over, and it's like he knows what's going to happen. And he says to Zomi, Mimitika, our first priority is to save Elder Komi's life. He can't climb the cliff to escape, so this balloon is his only chance. Later, no matter what I tell you to do, you have to obey. Do you understand? And he says that she is a student, so she must obey. And she says, I'm not obeying an order that's wrong. Which I love that she's immediately like, oh, no, you don't. We're not playing this fucking game, my friend. So at this point, the Earl has finished stripping the gondola of pretty much everything, except he is definitely bringing the tusks back with him, which I just hate him so much. Oh, I hate him so much. Luan says, who told you you get to fill the balloon with only your people? The villagers can climb the cliff. That's what they want to do anyway. Why can't you climb the cliff instead? You're fit and strong. The Earl looked at Luan as if he were crazy. Who knows how long I'll be stranded on top of that mountain? These trophies won't be properly preserved if I don't get them to a taxidermist in time. This dude, just all he cares about is the resource that he came for. These people do not mean anything to him. And this is reality. This is sheer reality. It is so, seeing it laid out in these bare terms makes it seem so much more obvious how terrible it is. But because we have put a million steps between ourselves and the reality of the rest of the world, we can tell ourselves it's not quite like this with all the other things that we have stripped countries for. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's just that simple. We just don't want it to be that simple, so we try and overcomplicate it. Yes, it is. So then Luan says, Zomi and I have to be in there to pilot the balloon unless one of you knows how to fly it. And the Earl looks at the two of them and says, oh, she knows how to fly the balloon? And Luan is like, yes, she's an excellent pilot. And the Earl says, oh, good, I won't need both of you then. So he is going to steal Luan's balloon and abandon him there and just take something that is totally not his. No compunction whatsoever. And Zomi is just screaming and trying to fight back. And one of the men slashes Luan in the leg with his hunting knife and injures him so badly that Zomi can see he is not going to be able to walk away. But he pretends he can. He pretends he's going to be okay. And he manages to be convincing enough in the moment that she trusts for a second it will be fine, and doesn't see that he was lying until they are in flight. And then she begins to realize that he is definitely saving her life and allowing himself to be abandoned, knowing he is going to die. It is really horrifying. So at this point, Luan says, we have to save Elder Komi. We can dangle a harness under the gondola to carry him to safety. The rest of us can make our way up the cliffs. And this is when Luan like stands up straight and he's like, you managed to climb the cliff before with a brace and I can do the same. And she sort of is like, well, okay. And they attach the brace and carry him up into the air. So he says, no matter what else you think of the moralists, their core belief is right. Sometimes you must do the right thing, even if it hurts you. Actions reify ideals. We must never stop striving to do good, to protect the weak and the powerless. This is the charge to all men of learning. And as he's like continuing to talk to her about how important she is, how much she has left to learn. And she's not really understanding why he's like lecturing her right now. And then, of course, it begins to become clear that this is his goodbye. Get your passengers to safety, and when the fire is burnt out, you can come and retrieve me on the other side of the mountain. Watch the wind currents carefully and fly as high as you can. So then he grabs a pole and begins to write on the ground for the villagers. And Zomi is like, the balloon is beginning to ascend. And all of a sudden, she realizes that they aren't actually like leaving the ground. The harness is dragging. And the Earl yells to cut off the harness. And she's like, why don't you ask one of your men to jump off? Because they're way heavier than this dude. And he starts to like scream at her and then realizes that she's super valuable and he can't alienate her. And starts to argue. And then she says, throw out the boar's heads then. And he says, that's the whole reason we came here. And then looks at one of his men. And before Zomi can react, they have cut the harness away. And the gondola tumbled crazily as the balloon finally lifted off. Elder Comey struggled out of the remnants of the harness while some of the villagers ran over to help him. And Luan, still standing in the same place, continued to write on the ground with his pole as the rest of the villagers watched. And she can see, because it's a huge pole and it's sand, so he has to draw really hugely. She can see what he's writing, and she's trying to figure out what he means. And it's a river flowing, a volcano, a stylized outline of a flame. The flow, the red volcano, the symbol of Lady Kana, goddess of fire, ash, cremation, and death. But skin of fire, what's that? So at this point, Zomi takes control of the balloon. And she does this thing that causes one of the boar's heads, she like tilts it so that the tusk rams into the Earl's eyes. Guys, just like, how satisfying is this? And then she tilts it again so that the gondola jerks and tosses all of the men who are coming at her to try and stop her into a heap. She scrambled over them and climbed over the side of the gondola and let go. And jumps off and winds up fucking like breaking both her legs. Yikes. Zomi finally managed to recover enough from the fall to suck in a lungful of air. She screamed with the pain. Overhead, the balloon continued to ascend as the men hanging on the outside of the gondola screamed, digging their fingers into the wicker with every ounce of strength. The Earl's curses came to them in a hailstorm that grew fainter as the balloon continued to rise, twisting about in the hot winds. So, I have mixed feelings because the Earl's men were trapped as well. And I don't like to say that when you are a servant this way that you are totally complicit, because you are being victimized as well. Like, these men literally have to bend down and create a seat for the Earl to sit on with their arms. That is how little they are seen as people. At the same time, they are not slaves, as far as I know. They are servants and could choose to not serve this man. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not 100% confident in that, but let's say that's the case. They are a little complicit. they're trying to preserve their own lives at the expense of these villagers as well. And while they may not necessarily have deserved the same exact treatment as the Earl, they chose to align themselves with this guy and didn't step forward to do anything to help anybody else. And to a degree, that is conditioning and brainwashing and abuse. To another degree, you are still a human being who can make choices. So I just don't know. It's a really tough call. It's a sort of thing where a lot of us, when we talk about there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, we try and use this as a bit of an excuse of doing whatever the fuck we want, no matter how damaging. And while I do believe that consumers cannot be held responsible the way that manufacturers should be held responsible, or the owners of companies and billionaires should be held responsible, I don't think that erases our responsibility completely. I don't think that we get to just completely step aside and be like, well, we're victims too, so what are you going to do? Yeah, we are victims too, but we could also try to do our best. And those aren't mutually exclusive, So yeah. And then when Luan comes up to her and is like, what the fuck? You broke both your legs. What are you doing? Zomi screams, you lied. You couldn't even walk, but you told me to get in that balloon to fly that pig to safety. And he dropped Elder Comey anyway. You lied. You were going to send me away and die here. My father abandoned me for duty, but I will never abandon someone I love for duty, no matter what the moralists say. I won't. And she just keeps yelling about this, and he doesn't even try to defend himself. And finally, she just sort of breaks down and starts crying. And he eventually just tries to explain, like, sometimes that you have to just appreciate your life for what it is, appreciate the moments, and know that it's going to come to an end eventually, and just accept that to a point. And she says, I refuse to live my life with such passivity. Accepting the flow is not passive. It's to understand that there is a balance in the universe and ultimate accounting. There's a time for Kana's fiery call to arms, and a time for Rappa's gentle call to slumber. I am meant to die here today, but you are not. Why? Why do you think you're meant to die? I once advised a king to commit an act of betrayal that I thought was the right thing to do, and I've never been able to forget the lives lost because of me. I've been trying to atone for it since. The signs tell me today is my day. I know I'm like vaguely remembering a thing, but I do not remember the details of what Luanzia did at all. And I am just racking my brain. So Kyle, if you're out there, please feel free to remind me whenever you listen to this episode. And at this point, Zomi is like, all right, well, if that's what you think, I guess maybe I'm meant to die too. And he's like, but you're really young. That doesn't feel right. And she's just like, dude, you don't get to have it both ways. Look, either I'm here to die or not. And they sort of sit ready to accept death together, when all of a sudden she is watching the way that the wind is blowing. And all of a sudden she realizes something that they can do. And what she does is she figures out how the wind is moving and that they can create like a break and cause the fire to essentially stop in its tracks. I'm going to read this thing. So I'm trying to find the spot. Teacher, I think there is a way. So they instead of sacrificing themselves for their guests, it looked like they were ready to escape with whatever possessions they could carry. They're all carrying out like furniture and wood and anything that can be lit on fire. They break it all apart, wrap it in oil-soaked rags, and then one group lit the makeshift torches and carried on their backs bundles of firewood and more jars of oil. Another grabbed shovels and hoes. Both groups then headed for the raging flames advancing on the hamlet. And by the time the rising heat made it impossible to move forward another inch, the villagers had reached the shrubs and saplings at the end of the woods. They went to work with shovels and hoes to dig a shallow ditch, worked quickly and efficiently, and carved out a shallow defensive moat. But what could such a small ditch do against the rampaging flames that they faced? The fire would easily be able to leap across it and devour the hamlet. The other group, meanwhile, had spread apart and dropped bundles of firewood in an arc on the farther side of the shallow moat. They emptied bottles of oil and liquor over the firewood, and then they set the bundles alight. In the face of fire, they added more fire. The new fires grew stronger, brighter, louder. Soon they were as high as a man, and then 2 men, 3 men. The crimson tongues extended to lick at the trees at the edge of the forest. Strangely, instead of leaning over to jump over the shallow, apparently useless ditch, the new wall of flames leaned forward towards the greater fire in the forest, like a child yearning for a hug from its mother. The wind grew even stronger, whipping the new flames into a frenzy. The trees at the edge of the forest caught, and the flaming arc roared in joy as it rushed for the embrace of the much greater fire on the other side, consuming anything that stood in its way. Undergrowth, fallen logs, living trees, thick layers of half-rotten leaves. Fire, driven by the hungry winds generated by the forest fire, had deprived itself of fuel. So Zomi had figured out that the way that the wind was turning, that they would be able to take away its fuel, and it wouldn't be able to leap toward them in the direction that it had seemed to be coming. It was simply continuing to spread because there was still fuel there, but the wind was not pushing it in that direction anymore. I reorchestrated the components of your logogram into a new idea machine to accomplish a new purpose. Instead of giving up in the face of death and feeding myself reasons, I sought to preserve life through an agent of destruction. So, yeah, I really enjoy this. For years, the teacher and the student wandered the islands of Dara, and we get a bit of a montage of her growing and learning and really learning to do logograms and like just focus a lot more on details of her education that they hadn't really been able to examine while she was traveling with him because there were so many other things to do and see. And it's honestly kind of beautiful. Like, I was rather touched by all of this. So finally, it's time for her to go home, and she is going to enter into the grand examination. And Zomi asks Luan if he will allow her to enter without telling anybody that he was her teacher. Because she is afraid, first of all, that if they hear who her teacher was, they will just like do him a favor and allow her to get ahead, even if she doesn't necessarily deserve it. She wants to know she earned it. And she is afraid if she doesn't do well, that it will bring shame on him. So she's just asking him to just, like give her a second. So she goes home, and her mother is just so understanding because Mimi is really trying to connect with her mother in the way that she used to when she was home before. And she is homesick, and it does feel good to be home. And it makes her nostalgic to eat foods that she had as a child. But when she begins to sort of recite a poem because of how wonderful the food is, and she realizes that her mother has no context for that poem, doesn't know what she's referencing, doesn't really understand even the relevance of it, Zomi is a little bit embarrassed by the fact that she is so elitist now that she can't even talk to her own mother. And this is something that I can totally understand happening, that like you grow into a new way of relating to the world. And because it is associated with people of higher classes, the fact that you have fallen into these patterns makes you feel like you have sort of betrayed where you come from. But there's no avoiding that to a degree. You can be conscious of it and you can do your best to like remind yourself where you come from and really like fight against becoming too snobby, really, in short. And I think that's important. But thinking that you can go into a whole different sphere of society, get an education outside of anything that the people you grew up around have had the privilege to even access, and remain unchanged through all of that, not realistic. You just won't be able to do that. That's just not how people work. So yeah, she was embarrassed by herself. She was reciting Amu poetry and quoting Confiji at her mother. Resolutely, she pulled the rice cake off the end of the eating stick, careless of how it stuck to her fingers, and took a big bite from it. When she put down the eating stick, she deliberately set it down so that it crossed obscenely with its companions on the table. Her mother nodded and went back to eating, but her motions were now awkward, uncertain, as though she was eating with the daughters of Master Sucre Ikejeje, their landlord, at the symbolic New Year's meal where the landlord was supposed to express thanks for the tenants, and the girls always sneered at the uncouth manners of the tenant farmers. As she counted the new wrinkles on her mother's face and the new patches on her dress, Mimi's heart twitched. So she tries to be like, so I'm going to stay and I am going to help you. And her mother is like, and I love that it's saying Mimi was utterly ashamed. Like her name, the way that she is referred to, changes here because of the way that she's feeling about her mom, you know, and the way that she's feeling about herself, really. But finally, we have this moment of Aki talking about a tax that has been levied on the owners of the lands and the landlords, and the fact that she is having to pay a higher rent, which she is making up for by basically being a servant to the landlord on top of her increased rent. And Mimi is just like, well, what the fuck? If the rent's higher, that's their responsibility. Like, you shouldn't be punished for that. You shouldn't be paying the difference. To which her mother is just like, oh, sweetie, I mean, no, I shouldn't, but come on. And even goes so far as to say, the fact that I am able to make up for the difference in the price by being his servant is a pretty good deal. I'm actually kind of lucky that I can do it this way rather than being even more broke. So, like, she says that she is going to stay, and her mother argues with her and is like, look, you aren't meant for this life anymore. You have transformed into somebody else. And that was what I wanted. That was why I let you go and travel. And you've always been restless. You've always wanted more. But now that you've gone out into the world and you've really seen how much more is out there, that restlessness is even larger than it used to be. You can't stay here. You won't be happy. And Mimi says that she will make her proud and bring her honor and wealth. And Aki comes over and says, all I care about is that you're happy. You are setting out into the wide sea, my baby, and I'm sorry that Mama does not have the knowledge or skills to help you. I love this so much, guys. This is so sweet. I appreciate very much that her mother is as selfless as she is and not holding it against her or trying to keep her child around after having lost the rest of her family, which would be totally understandable. So now, chapter 17, Through the Veil. We find out that there were a bunch of scholars outside of the Great Hall, all trying to get inside and cause trouble and fight because they were angry that they had been passed over during the examination. And DeFiro is saying that he dispersed them by saying, yes, the emperor is interested in hearing the complaint, but since there are so many of you, he prefers to receive a single petition signed by the most insightful scholar. Emperor Reagan will personally review the petition, bypassing imperial tutor Ruthie. You may even get a private audience with the emperor himself. And Kuni is very pleased with this, and they wind up having to sort of explain to Firo why this was such a smart idea. And Rosanna explains to him that, or not Rosanna, she asks him, remember what it was like when you and your friends played war, who got to be the marshal? And Firo is like, I got to be the marshal. I don't understand what you're getting at here. And Kuni is watching this and is like, he gets to be the marshal, which is the best character to play in that game. And of course he can't understand and put himself in any other shoes because he is privileged due to being the emperor's son. So I have to teach him that I have to teach him to play in other ways and get people who are willing to force him to play parts that that he isn't interested in, so that he gets the experience and the perspective that he isn't getting right now. And I really love Kuni noticing this. I mean, it's a simple question, the game. It's not something that I think a lot of people would see. And Kuni, coming from a less privileged background, is a huge advantage in him really seeing the truth of this and the importance of this. But also the fact that he is so keen to know that when somebody is playing a game like this, it's training. This is something that is putting the way court works into a simpler dynamic for a child so that we can pretend it's a game and it really is and isn't at the same time. So DeFiro explains that all of these scholars out there want to think that they're the fucking smartest. And by saying that the emperor only wants to hear from the smartest of them, now they're all just fighting with one another. And DeFiro says, let's see. They started pointing out each other's grammar mistakes, and the mistakes in the corrections, then the mistakes in the corrections to the corrections. One started to sarcastically remark on the accents with which autoepigrams were recited. Another pointed to the anachronistic style of the declaimed speeches. I let them go on in this vein for a bit until they'd gotten red in the face and properly thirsty with all that oration, and I showed them how to get to the best pubs in Pan. And then Kuni says, this is why Raoji once said, if 10 scholars were to start a rebellion, it would take them 3 years of argument just to agree on a name for their faction. This is wonderful, and I feel like this is a really good summary of where Democrats are standing at the moment. We are so concerned with just correcting everybody else. And I don't think there is anything wrong with emphasizing that people need to be more concerned about their language and their inclusivity. That is essential, 100%. But I also think that we tend to get a little too wrapped up in making sure an ideology is absolutely perfect before we take action at all. And then we wind up doing nothing. And sometimes you just got to do the best you can and try and push things through so that we can move forward in any way. And if it's not perfect, we will amend it We will improve it. But for fuck's sake, can we just do something? And at this point, Firo says, it sounds like you'd fit right in with them, Tototika. And Timu is feeling really like embarrassed by this. And Thera, the princess, who, by the way, didn't need this explained to her because she understood immediately what the fuck was going on here. She sees all of the other Panmeiji, they are all looking rather embarrassed because they are basically, all of them are scholars and they're being like talked about in these sort of like mocking terms. And she says, I'm sure Father is grateful that you diverted the momentary rage of the learned scholars, the backbone of the imperial bureaucracy, without any harm. They're the true treasure of Dara. And she bows to Defiro, and Defiro bows back, and Kuni is very pleased with her. Can he just make her fucking empress and just be done with it? Jesus. Ugh. So finally, we have the sort of like confrontation between Zomi and Kuni. And she's like, you may have distracted them, but the fundamental problem about the unfairness of the exams is still there. And he says something about how it's going to take time for everybody to catch up with Han, with their level of education. And she's like, it is not about other places catching up with Han. You have folks out here devoting their lives to learning a dead language when other people are never able to take the time off from toiling in order to stay alive. They literally cannot educate themselves or they will starve to death. And you can't expect those people to be on equal footing to students who can devote every hour of the day to tutoring and training. That is an inherent disadvantage. And she talks about, look at these men. Not a single one of them has ever had to work for his next meal or had to beg a corvée administrator for a reprieve. I doubt any of them can tell an ear of sorghum apart from an ear of wheat, or know the weight of the fish in the boat after a day of trawling. Has anyone in the College of Advocates ever told you that your policy of increasing the taxes on the merchants would end up harming the small farmers you aimed to help? When the taxes go up on the merchants, who, as the Empress has noted, also tend to be large landowners, they pass on the tax to their tenants and increase their burden. That is not supposed to. I know that isn't supposed to happen, but it does. It happened to my mother. You may have your edicts and policies, but in the villages the wealthy do what they will and the poor must obey. The voices of the poor are not heard in these halls, and so you do not understand their plight. And Kuni is trying to be like, I come from such, and she's like, well then you should know better than anybody to consider this a lot more carefully. All of these people, by the way, who are in here other than me, who are students presenting their thesis, are all dudes. So do you not think that that is significant? You may have supposedly opened this to women, but only a few dozen of the Kashima who even came to Pan for the grand examination are women, and out of those barely a handful make it into the ranks of the Furoa. What do those in your College of Advocates know of the beauty prized by women that isn't for the delectation of men, or the plight of women who must raise children without any of the advantages given to men, or the reasons some sell themselves to the indigo houses, or the causes that make the choice of a marriage akin to bondage seem reasonable to so many? And Rasana is over here fucking nodding like, yup, this bitch is right though. I love this so much. She berated herself inside for having been so absorbed by the worries of life in the palace that she had not done more for all those others who lived just like she had. Bless you, Rasana. I love you. Can your Fioroa react with anything but condescension toward a fisherman's song composed from rough and simple words of his dialect? And she goes on with this. You have forgotten. And the emperor tries to interrupt and be like, just because we can't get it perfect doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. Mampidere had a way worse system. And she's like, yeah, I mean, cool. I don't really understand the fucking relevance of that. You're over here with a rotting hold of fish pointing at this guy and laughing because his hold of rotting fish is bigger than yours. What the fuck kind of like legacy is that to leave behind? Well, I left behind a really shitty system that still left people out, but you know, it was better than the other guy. So whatever, you know, the problem. So fucking do something, essentially. And he tries to say something about how, like, you are the fulfillment of my trust and hope for the system. You came from nothing and look where you are. And she's like, I got really lucky in who my master is, and all, like, a bunch of things just fell into place in my life. And Kuni says it's the will of the gods then. And she says, if you seek true talent, then your system of examination resembles the man who seeks pearls only by diving from the wharf because it is safe and convenient, all the while arguing that the random motion of the tides will move pearls of great value into his reach. And everybody sort of goes silent at this point because they're like, fuck, she's dead ass right though. And at this point, Prince Firo gets up and is like, it sounds like you're just jealous that you're not rich. All these other families who are rich, like, they worked really hard to get there. Why shouldn't their children benefit from that? And at this point, she does a little demonstration. And she has 4 boxes. And she says, under one of these is a treat, a piece of cake. The other 3 boxes are empty. The princes and princesses may each pick a box, and whatever you find in the box, that is your dessert. If you find yourself in possession of the 1,000-layer cake, you have no obligation to share with your siblings. If you find yourself holding an empty box, you must not complain. Do you like this arrangement? That's unfair, said Farah, her voice crisp and childish. We should share. Why is it unfair? I didn't do anything wrong, said Firo. Why should I get an empty box? To which she's like, right. You're behaving as if these people's good fortune is just like their hard work, but there are children being born into rich families and they did not do anything to earn that birth. It was an accident. And the people born into poor families did not do anything to earn hardship. It was an accident. Come on. Like, and Prince Timu says, just because we are all meant to be equal in the eyes of the gods doesn't mean that we are going to live equal lives. And I love her response. I see. Prince Timu, you will surely not object then if I eat the 1,000-layer cake and give you the wrapping paper to lick. In fact, why don't we switch places so that I can experience the suffering of your many cares in the palace and you get to experience the nobility of poverty in my muddy hut? To which he just, again, does not have a fucking answer. I love how this ends because Farah's like, all right, so let's see which one of us got the cake, because they're all looking at their empty boxes. They all open their boxes. And every single fucking box is empty. And Farah's like, you said there was cake in one of these. And Zomi's like, yeah, isn't that funny how you get told that, like, somebody's going to succeed and then nobody succeeds? It's almost like we keep being promised something and then nothing ever changes or happens. Weird. So at this point, Kuni is like, all right, look, I get what you're saying here. Can we get to the, like, actual thesis that you wanted to present, since you said that the one you wrote isn't actually what you want to say? And she says, I think we should abolish the use of onologograms and classical ono in the examination altogether. Testing should only be done using Zindari letter writing in the vernacular. And everybody is like, what? Are you fucking high? And she's just like, regular people don't have the time or ability to learn this stuff. They simply can't do it. So you are literally locking them out at the most basic levels. They're like, they cannot participate. You're behaving as if we're all on an equal plane. No, we are not. Inherently, we are not. Meanwhile, Thera is watching Zomi and is like, this bitch is it. She is the tits. I love her. And I love Thera so much in this moment. Zomi was like a lightning bolt that had lit up a dark sky, which like, bitch, you don't even know the truth of that, do you? The lightning. She had never believed it was possible to turn the world upside down like this, to reimagine it as though nothing that had come before mattered. Which I'm like, Thera, if you can just keep that fucking energy for becoming Empress and getting your brothers out of the way, I will love you forever, because that's what needs to fucking happen. And we all goddamn know it. It takes about a month for a child to learn the Zindari letters and to start composing in the vernacular, yet we deem writing with Zindari letters to be unacceptable. Schools constructed around the logograms can only be attended by those who don't have to live off the fruits of their own labor. The kind of arguments prized under such a system are sclerotic, lifeless, oriented toward the past. If we abolish the need for logograms and write the wisdom of the new age in the vernacular using only Zindari letters, there will be such a flourishing of learning across Dara that you will have a much better chance of finding the talent you desire. Instead of seeking pearls in the shallow reefs near the wharfs of Han, you will be casting the net far and wide across the entire ocean. And then she goes on to be like, I don't say that the logograms aren't worth anything. They're beautiful, they're important, they are historic. All of that is true. But we don't need to be dealing with our modern society and population using ideas that are essentially esoteric and out of reach. And at this point, everybody starts talking at once. And that is the end of the chapter. So yeah, I loved this. I love Zomi. I love Ken Liu. I wish everybody would read these books. And thank you, Kyle. I love you too. Until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.